Every generation must do things afresh. Don't simply copy the past. Education is not simply subject learning, skill learning, getting jobs. No doubt those are absolutely essential. But how to be citizens in society. Wonder Woman is not a feminist hero because feminism can only happen if it's collective. I don't think we should say better, worse, fluid, fixed. I find that's I would say a careless way of thinking. We need a much more nuanced way of thinking about at any point in time, many different things were happening, and in what ways were they actually advancing or not advancing.
Hello everyone, welcome all. I am Shravesh and this is my friend Tanvi, and we are the student coordinators of Politics, the academic club of political science from the Alliance School of Liberal Arts. Today is a special day at Politics because we have with us today Professor Mary John. Right, Tanvi?
Yes. Oh, yes. So we have here with us today one of the most senior and lead scholars and academician in of women politics, feminist politics, and that is Professor Mary E. John.
Thank you.
And
So I think Tanvi would begin on a lighter note with an icebreaker question.
so to break the ice, if you could create a feminist superhero, what would be her powers and how would she smash patriarchy?
I wouldn't have, I'm sorry, but I'll disappoint you because it's not feminist to have one, like Wonder Woman, right? Wonder Woman is not a feminist hero because feminism can only happen if it's collective. I mean, there has to be your Justice League, or not even the Justice League would do it. You would have to have a very large number of women of varying backgrounds who would find reason to want to work together.
What if you could create a feminist superhero?
Oh gosh, I'd have all kinds of them, you know, and I'd have ones who are not heroic at all, who might seem extremely shy and incapable. I'd have some who are very daring, I know, but it would have to be a group of very mixed people. That's all I can say.
Okay, that's a very creative answer.
So no Wonder Woman for me.
No wonder.
So I would also like to highlight that the feminist perspective in India has been changing recently, because we have also been able to look at several other disciplines through a feminist lens.
Yes.
And we have also been, I mean, when we talk about women, when we have a qualm about women not being there when we study about history and politics and so on. The thing is that women are there, and you'll have to dig at the right place. You'll have to have the correct perspective to understanding how they operate there, what is their agency in these fields and so on. In that sense, feminism has impacted several other disciplines.
Yes.
And we are also in the need of having more feminist perspective to other social sciences. Whether it is we've had statistics and all other disciplines play a major role in studying and researching, but we would are in the high. I would like to highlight the need of bringing in more feminist perspective in a more radical sense. And I would like, if you could give us a bit of an insight into how you came into pursuing feminist studies and feminist theory and so on.
Okay, actually that's not a straightforward question because I absolutely did not grow up feminist. I grew up thinking that, in fact, I had an undergraduate degree in science, which I then gave up and wanted to move into economics, the social sciences, thinking that poverty in India is one of our biggest problems. And I would tell everybody that as a woman, I have not suffered. I have not felt any discrimination in my life. Poverty is the only issue. So for many years, I cannot say that I espoused any kind of active feminist thinking. It came very much later in life. It came in fact, at the PhD stage, your undergraduates. I only took up women's issues very seriously when I was doing my PhD in the US in philosophy, and switched to feminist philosophy and feminist issues after that. Because it was the first time I really felt that everybody said, you're a woman from India, you must talk about Indian women's problems and make that and first I rebelled against that, but then I realized, okay, that's not a very useful response. Also, American culture shocked me because I thought this is a country of freedom. this is a country of liberation, and it was anything but. I felt extremely objectified as a woman. I felt marginalized as a woman. So I ended up taking up feminist issues at that late stage in my career.
So, yeah.
Professor, from that answer, I would like to narrow down the question a bit. You've been in this field for a very long time.
Yes,
and
by now,
this
yes.
field is constantly progressing. It's not
Yes,
static.
it is.
There are different perspectives emerging with each new scholar coming in, innovating how it is to be studied and so on. So, what kind of approach were you expecting the feminist studies to have when you were back in the days where you were there leading the Center for Women's Development? So, what kind of thought did you have about how this was going to go about in India? And do you think the kind of feminist studies that we have right now have concurred to your expectations that you were holding back in those days?
Okay, that's a difficult question. Actually, I expected, I returned to India with a PhD in the 1990s, early 1990s, and I did expect to see much more feminist thinking in the various disciplines. Not as much as I expected. There were women's studies centers, which were very, very small in select universities with sometimes only 1 or 2 faculty members doing work that was outside of or didn't seem to have too much impact on mainstream disciplines. The only exception I would say was sociology. Because in sociology, you study topics like family, marriage as part of mainstream sociology. So there's a way in which the topic enters in some form. But other than that, I found too little, actually, engagement, which changed over time. The engagement grew, and centers of women's studies grew. Scholars with backgrounds in the subject grew also in the various disciplines. So you had feminist economists, feminist historians. There are many well-known names. Uma Chakravarti is a very well-known feminist historian, for instance. So people in literature, Susie Taro, very well known in the field of literature, who's produced volumes on women's writings in the literary field. So these things emerged in the 1990s. The growth of the field, I would say, happened not so much out of our goodwill, but out of being questioned by others. So when after what were called, I don't know if you're familiar with the anti-Mandal moment of 1990, when there was a proposal by the government to introduce reservations for other backward classes. And there was a heavy backlash against that on the part of most people with upper castes who saw this as an invasion of their freedom and their equality. A similar attack, not as mainstream, happened also in the women's movement. So Dalit women said, where are we in your movement? We may be there only as landless laborers or in some marginal capacity as subjects of your study, but where are we as leaders? Muslim women, we had very, very, very famous case called the Shah Banu case, in which a Muslim woman came forward to demand alimony from her divorced husband. It became a hugely communal issue. She withdrew her case. The women's movement at that time, this was in the mid-80s, late 80s, they were not prepared for the backlash. And then they had to rethink. And at that time, the cry had been, we need a uniform civil code, a common law, personal law for all groups, family, at the level of family, marriage, divorce, adoption, and so on. Nobody thought that there was any two ways about that. That was the only way forward. However, with this case and other cases, people recognized that all communities are not equal, that there was a great fear that a uniform code would actually be a Hindu code, a disguised or not so disguised Hindu code, and it would be at the expense of minorities. So we also had to learn that the hard way. So the women's movement rethought their position on a uniform civil code and has come out with a much more interesting combination of positions, saying, yes, have reform within personal laws, as well as have secular general laws that apply to everyone. So I would say we grew not by design, but by accident, by events taking place that forced us to, you don't rethink very easily. Most of the time you run along thinking you know what you're doing. It's when you're forced to rethink that new ideas emerge. And I think the women's movement in India is a very good example of that.
That was really insightful. So education has been always a tool for breaking stereotypes. So when we say education, we mean educating young boys and girls in an ideal, equal social setting to mutually learn about each other, respect each other, and so on. So how do you think moving forward in a social setting, especially for the underprivileged? So any measures that you would recommend?
You mean in terms of bringing more underprivileged into education?
Yes.
I think that is happening by its own. See, 150 years ago, it was considered highly controversial in the 19th century for a girl to be sent to school. They thought she would be corrupted, her morals would be corrupted, she should stay at home. Now it would be very peculiar, even in a poor family, if a girl didn't go to school. Okay, so even the poor are sending their children to school, often paying fees for a bad private education, thinking it's better than the government education. So I don't think the problem is only access. Of course, in a village, where is there a college or a university? You could ask. That's a very and what do we do there? The problem, I feel, is no longer just access. Can they get in? The question is what happens afterwards. What are the experiences? If you're a Dalit child in a school which is casteist, which expects the Dalit children to sit on one side of the room, or expects them to sweep the room clean afterwards, that's the problem. What is the experience of such a student in such a setting? Okay, so if students are treated unequally, if teachers have certain ways of approaching education where they believe that the child of a domestic worker is no point teaching her, she will not, because her parent is illiterate. What is she going to learn at home? If you have that kind of attitude on the part of, so the problem is not just access, the problem is what happens inside. The problem is also teachers. What are their attitudes? What is their sensitization? When we say gender sensitization, are they sensitized to class? Are they sensitized to poverty? Are they recognizing that children have very, very different resources? Half the time in a school today, you expect the teacher to do the homework for the student. Most of us would not manage if we didn't have parents who are constantly aiding and abetting us. But if the parent hasn't had schooling, then who's going to help the kid at home? So I believe those are the kinds of questions we need to answer if we want to really move ahead.
Okay.
Professor, I think that furthers down into a more a deep structural question, which is that when we are discussing about the underprivileged in a feminist perspective, it is important to know how people are privileged differently. Because if you are a girl from an urban setting, you will, in a certain sense, be more privileged than a man from a countryside.
Could be.
And if these identities mark a qualitative difference when we are trying to build a collective homogeneous female identity in terms of collectively addressing feminist issues and the problems that women face. So we also have to address this kind of qualitative differences that we have in us.
So I would say, I would question only one word, use the word homogeneous. We don't need a homogeneous identity. We should not. We are diverse people, and diverse people need diverse journeys. You're very right to point out that there can be privilege. See, all of us are a combination of so many things, okay? I may be disprivileged as a woman, but I am privileged in terms of my class background, right? So we are a combination of many things, and that's what intersectionality should imply, that we are this combination. So where we fall exactly in terms of the kind of disadvantages we get or the discrimination we receive must be looked at carefully. So let us not aim for homogeneity. Let us aim for equality in difference, right? Different yet equal. That's what we should be aiming for.
Sometimes do you think that this very concept of intersectionality would subsume a larger feminist cause? In terms of women have underlying problems of some kind which are similar to each other. And sometimes when we are so much obsessed with these identities that we often try to mark out,
Yes.
Do you think it would subsume a larger feminist cause and undermine it in a...
Yeah, I think there's two sides. You're right at one level, or rather, the history of most struggles has been to emphasize sameness, commonality, the same aims, end all violence, equal wages for equal work, whatever. These are general kinds of aims that we have, and we think that everybody shares them in the same way. Now, that is true, that it cannot be false. How can it be false to say end violence for all women or have equal pay for equal work for all women? But when we try to actually implement them and the contexts are very different for different kinds of people, we will have to recognize that there will be diversity as well. That's the hard part. And unfortunately, we tend to very quickly, and at least let me put it this way, those of us who've occupied dominant positions in setting an agenda, we are very quick to see division and divisiveness. We don't accept disagreement very easily. If somebody says, I don't identify with that problem. Okay, so you can take the example of abortion, for instance, which is a very interesting and important issue. Now, there are times when women said, abortion is not my problem because I am being faced with forced sterilization. The government of India thinks I have too many children and is out to sterilize me. Why should I be worried about my abortion rights? That's maybe your problem, that's not my problem. So then we need to broaden our understanding of reproductive rights that is not concentrating on one particular kind of campaign regarding my body, my rights, the children I may have or I may not want to have. So we have to build in differences of this nature, even if we want to push towards an area where we say everybody has a choice. But since our actual social conditions actually do not give us equal choices, a middle-class woman may feel that there's no pressure, or she anyway only wants 1 or 2 children, no pressure on her whatsoever regarding any. But a woman where the belief is that she's going to have extra children is immediately under a very different kind of pressure, right? So for her, abortion may not be where she's at, okay? So we have to find ways to build bridges and commonalities without assuming that we're all the same. And we have failed in many areas in that, and maybe done somewhat better in some cases. But we've also made mistakes in that. Because equality doesn't mean sameness. That's the problem.
India is very much known for its cultural traditions. And sometimes there is an enormous cultural backlash which is based on social roles, and those are questioned. And we also understand that conservative sections of the society, they've had problems with liberal feminist struggle for a very long time. To what extent do you think that cultural relativism is valid and tradition and modern feminism can coexist? Like, what is the threshold for it to happen?
I don't know that cultural relativism is the answer. The term cultural relativism implies that there are very separate groups, each on their own island, as it were, living with their own customs, and we don't live like that. The islands have gone away. We are completely interdependent. We are completely intermingled. There are, I don't know, maybe in the Andamans, there are still certain groups who deserve to live the way they want, and we have no business in interfering with them. But that is completely on one side it's not part of our life. So we should not be thinking in terms of cultural relativism. We should be thinking in terms of what would make it possible for people to live together better. And that involves differences. Okay, so if religion is a dividing force today, what would make it possible for people to believe that, yes, we can live together and we can live together in dignity and we don't have to fear? Because unfortunately, our groups are not equal. Our numbers are not equal. Everybody thinks in terms of majorities and minorities. That is the reality in India, at least, and I think in most parts of the world. And therefore, the fear of majoritarianism is very real. The reactiveness on the part of a minority to majoritarianism is very real. It does not often produce good results. In fact, women are often the losers. When every group is trying to maintain their cultural identity, they often say, then our women have to, remain loyal, which means they become more patriarchal. This is a very common reaction. Keep the women at home, make sure they don't move around, make sure they don't interact with other people. We have to protect them in a certain way. And that creates a very, very negative atmosphere within which, and we've seen this in our history. I mean, if you want examples, I can give them, but if you think that may be controversial, I won't. So lots of groups have suffered as a consequence of these differences. So I would not say cultural relativism. I would say we have to have common principles, but we also have to recognize where there is dominance and where there is marginalization. Otherwise, the dominant people will keep on saying, let's do things this way, not recognizing what it's like for others who are not so located.
Is that where equity comes into play?
Yeah. I mean, genuine, not equity is a very weak word. I would say where genuine equality comes into play. which means also giving advantages where people have not had them. So in India, for instance, we've had a reservation policy for groups who have been traditionally disadvantaged. Because if you say, oh, we'll treat everybody equal, they'll still remain at the back because there's no chance they don't have the resources that others have. You're urban, well-educated, will always take the jobs, will always get the benefits, and they will remain where they are. So you need to have what's called positive discrimination to enable groups who have been left out to play their part, right? So that is the kind of, I don't think the frame of cultural relativism is helpful.
It's helpful.
So there are there are debates going around sexual violence against women, and you've also referred it to in your lecture. And there are multiple perspectives to understanding it. There is a biological perspective, there is a psychological, psychosexual perspective to it, and there is on the other end there is also a material perspective to it, because people are highlighting the material conditions of the people that makes them unaware of the things that they. There's a sense of lack of awareness in people with in the lower ranks of the society. So all of that criticism is there. So what a perspective would you think best aligns with a feminist analysis? And because you have been, and what kind of policy measures would you suggest the state undertake? Because you've also been, your work has been more influential in policy, state crafting its policy, and so on. But you've also talked about legal reforms during the lecture. But what can you give as a broader picture into how it has been taken forward?
I think legal reforms have taken up too much space, actually, and I would say that I was guilty of that in my lecture as well. Gender sensitizing is actually much, much more necessary, which is where I feel educational institutions play a very, very important role. From the school onwards, there should be sensitizing. We should not assume that young people, children, young adults are being socialized into the kinds of ways of interacting and being with each other that are conducive to the reduction of violence. We live in actually societies that are not necessarily overtly, but covertly very violent. They're extremely competitive. People are constantly being incited to be successful. Most men, for instance, are constantly feeling that they are failing. What does it mean if you have a masculine ideal that is beyond you? So men are suffering, I think, from that kind of problem, which can take many, many forms, including violent forms. Why do we see more overt violence in poor areas, in slum areas? We associated them with greater overt violence. This does not mean there's no violence in a middle class area. It may be invisible to us. But there is overt violence, no doubt, because the frustration of that failure unfortunately takes the form of then wreaking violence on others who are weaker than you, which is usually women and children. So we need to find ways, therefore, to describe this, to create gender sensitizing as it's not, I wouldn't call it a policy, but as a way of moving forward as part of education. Education is not simply subject learning, skill learning, getting jobs. No doubt those are absolutely essential. But how to be citizens in society? What would it mean to be a good gendered citizen in society? What would that look like? What would it look like to recognize caste differences in our society? Things nowadays we talk about gender, but do we talk about caste? Almost never. Do we talk about our religious differences? Almost never. It's not easy. It would be a big challenge, especially in a school context. I think it would be a challenge. Some things may be better left to college levels or to high school levels, but we badly need sex education. We need sex education appropriate to age at different points in time, because I think as a culture, we are very hopeless at it. Our parents, I don't think, teach us anything appropriate, frankly. Okay, so we need those kinds of inputs, it seems to me, to deal with violence, because there are a lot of violence need not be.
I think society assumes that all of those is Western ideas,
Yes.
or like sex education, for example,
Yeah,
implementing in higher secondary schools or colleges. It's all like Americanized or like that.
Get everybody to read the Kama Sutra and ask yourselves what's Western here.
Yes.
No, not true.
Because there is this very notion that the gender roles that we perceive them as today, which they have a lot of Victorian colonial influence under.
Yes, they do. In
So
fact,
there are
that's the
some
biggest influence.
Yeah. So there are some arguments that we were a bit more progressive in this sense in the past. Gender roles were more fluid in the past. There are people adapting, which is not. I mean, would you think that we will have to apply our current understanding of our contemporary society when we study about the past or when we analyze the role of women?
Yeah, I think those are very careful. Those are tricky. I wouldn't say neither is true. It is neither true that the past was a terrible time and the modern times were the freedom and liberty came to us. Nor is it true that the past was a great time and then the Muslims came and then the British came and everything went to the dogs. No, neither of those is useful. Each era had its own time and material conditions. I mean, think of an ancient society with its material conditions at that time, widespread poverty, very small, what kind of family lives were there then, what kind of texts were being produced in that context, as distinct from further along, when we were suffered the colonialism of, the British, what were their policies, some of which were terrible, but some of which were also not so terrible. It is true that we had a lot of practices that were problematic. It is true that most girls were married off before puberty, and that to men who were much older than them. Okay, this was definitely the case. It wasn't even called child marriage. There was no word for it because women were not considered children and adults in the first place. There were any number of practices. We practiced casteism. Dalits were not even allowed to enter certain villages. They lived outside the village. Those were our practices. Okay. So to some extent, the British played a game. They wanted our money, they wanted our land, they wanted our revenue, they wanted our products. In exchange for that, they thought they would civilize us, quote unquote. Okay, that's a game that they played, but it doesn't mean that everything that they did was wrong. We didn't have to be colonized, but it's not as though the issues that they raised were not sometimes absolutely fair issues, and that we needed to tackle them. So I don't think we should say better, worse, fluid, fixed. I find that's I would say a careless way of thinking. We need a much more nuanced, I think that's one of the phrases you have, right? We need a much more nuanced way of thinking about at any point in time, many different things were happening, and in what ways were they actually advancing or not advancing.
Could you share a moment from your academic career that deeply impacted your understanding of feminism? Or perhaps you could tell us a bit more about the way you responded to these constructive criticisms, so we can get insights on how the feminist academia views and responds to these criticisms.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm trying to remember. I think, well, as I said, one of them I mentioned earlier was my first encounter in the US in a different context altogether, most unexpectedly, where I felt I was being feminized and I was being marginalized as a woman. I was expecting to be treated as an equal. I thought this was the most advanced society in the world, and it didn't turn out to be so. That's one moment that made me rethink my own career. I ended up changing my topic of research for my PhD as a consequence. So that had a big impact on me. I think another moment was when this was in the 1990s when the anti-Mandal had happened, when the Babri Masjid was torn down. Those were moments when, in the women's movement too, questions were raised by Dalit feminists, by Muslim women, saying, why are you so shocked by these developments? Yes, these are shocking developments, but think about the structural nature of the society we are in. Where are we in your movement? Have you given us space to speak about our issues? And that again forced me to rethink what I had assumed at that time. I thought these were not central to my life.
Okay, what is your piece of advice from your long experience both as an activist and a researcher who seek to understanding the widening focus of feminism today? What focus do you think will be or should be central to both of them in bringing about real progressive changes that benefits all sections of the Indian society?
Well, I think that you as a younger generation are in a very unique place. I feel that we have been through our phases of life, our generation and the generation maybe next to me. We have gone through many phases, as I've described also to you over time in the last 70, 50, 60, 70 years. I think that the 21st century generation of young people who were born basically around 2000, your generation, I take it, are facing a world which is quite different from ours. When we were growing up, we believed everything would get better. We believed that the society would change, that that inequalities would go away, and it was just a matter of time, and we were on the right side of history. we were proven completely wrong. You, however, have your eyes open. You know, unlike us, you know that life is tough. You know that the future is hard. There's talk of climate change. There is talk of whether the planet is even going to exist in another 100 years. We had no idea that's anything like, you have to imagine that we didn't know there was no climate change and nothing in our time. We thought more and more is better, okay? So you are facing historically unique challenges where the future doesn't look bright. In that context, you need to find, and you have the benefit of history. Make best of that. It's available to you. Look into it. Talk to others. Find out what you like. But then you have to take a call. Because you see, I'm 68 years old. I don't know how many more years I have. I hopefully have some more years. But my institutional life is now over. In that sense, I don't have an institutional space. You are going to be the future. So I know it sounds maybe a little strong, but I do think that every generation must do things afresh. Don't simply copy the past. That's how change happened. Changes happened because people thought afresh, and people sometimes turned their back on history and decided that they would do things differently. So you need to do that too. I would say that you need to think afresh, given that you know a whole lot. You're not ignorant, I don't think. You know a great deal. You know enough. If there's too much history, you'll get swallowed up by it. So you need agency of your own in a time that actually sounds very hopeless, but need not be, because at every point of hopelessness, people have done things. But I don't think it's for us to tell you. I don't think it's for the old to tell you. I think young people should have a chance to do it themselves, including making mistakes. You'll make mistakes. How can you not? You know? Yeah. So that's my advice to you.
Yes. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing really intellectual thoughts. It was an honor for us having you here at our campus today. Your presence really motivates us to engage in women's studies and carry forward the legacy.
And thank you once again, Professor John.
Thank you
we look forward to welcoming you
It was very
back
nice
soon.
talking to you.
Thank you.